subject, and it's exciting to do it. It's also a little bit challenging sometimes being a new talk that we're always struggling to put things together until the last minute, it seems, but we managed to finish it about 15 minutes ago, which is which is pretty much par for the course for us. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen here in just a second. Hopefully you can see that now.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, super. So about 15 minutes ago, I pointed out to Amanda that we didn't actually have a title screen for this program. We're like, okay, ready to go. Oh, we don't have a title screen, so, or a title for that matter. And so we just created this one really quickly, and it was Amanda's suggestion. And we're going to talk about the meaning of "Until the Wheels Fall Off" a little bit later on. But I like the title, so I just decided to go with it. But the story of South Bend's Municipal Weed Ordinance, so that's what we're here to talk about today, is what we did to successfully get the city to adopt the most progressive invasive species ordinance in the state of Indiana. And the story is involved, and it goes back a few years. And so we're going to recount the story of how we got from the point of the first slide, which goes back to 2015, actually, up until current day. And so, like all great conservation stories, this story begins on the golf course. Okay, thanks for laughing. So this is actually Elbel Park, which is northwest of South Bend. It's in rural St. Joe, well, just out on the outskirts of South Bend, west of the South Bend Airport. And the area is on the map represented by the red rectangle. The red bordered rectangle is Elbel Park. And that little row of lakes that you see running through there is a chain of lakes region of western St. Joe County, and it includes some very important high quality areas from a natural history standpoint. The bright green block in the center represents the Leidig Bog property. And so this particular story with Elbel Park came about because Elbel Park is actually a South Bend Park property. It's the largest property in the South Bend Park system at 315 acres, I believe. It is a golf course. And golf had been losing money for a number of years. And in 2015, the city decided that they were going to sell the golf course. And so just using this map to put things into perspective to show where it's at in relation to some of these quality areas. The area represented at the bottom of that map, bordered by the orange rectangle, is Chamberlain Lake, which is a state dedicated nature preserve. And the Leidig Bog property is now also a state dedicated nature preserve. And that was one that just the year before, I had the honor of being one of the first people to ever venture into that property for a long, long time. And we wound up, along with Scott Namisnik and Roger Hedge from DNR, and we wound up bringing that property to the attention of Shirley Hines Land Trust, who acquired it in about the same time that the Elbel Park sale was going down. And so this kind of just represents the importance of this particular area and relevance to how this story got started. So I mentioned in 2015, at the end of 2015, the city announced that they were going to sell Elbel Park to either to a private golf course or possibly to a real estate developer. And there was a lot of public outrage over it, over the concept of, number one, selling 315 acres of public land to private development. But also number two was that people, I think, seemed to realize that it was a high quality natural area, even though that had never really been quantified by the city of South Bend. So around that time, a group of grassroots citizens got together. They called themselves Elbel for Everyone, and they organized and really worked hard. You know, you hear these stories about these conservation organizations being founded around dining room tables, like Save the Dunes Council, for example. This was really sort of the same thing, just a group of people who mostly didn't know each other, getting together to try to figure out what they could do to prevent the city from selling this property. And some of these photos were pictures that I took at the time of some of these community meetings and some of these gatherings in folks' living rooms, and people going to the city council to voice their opposition to selling the property. The photo at the bottom right is one of my favorites, even though it's a blurry, not so good photo. But that's Ricky Klee, one of the people who was involved in the group, with his little daughter up at the podium talking to the city council and holding a banana, voicing his opposition to selling the park. And the subtitle, "The Cavalry Isn't Coming," came about from a particular meeting that I had with these folks, where they were all talking about who they could get that was going to step in and stop the city. We see this a lot of this reactiveness sometimes in these citizen conservation groups, where an entity, a city or county, decides that they're going to dispose of a property or build a highway through a property or build a bridge through a property. And all of a sudden, everybody's grabbing to try to figure out what they can do. Who can we get to stop this? We can go, will the county park stop it? Will the DNR stop it? Will IDEM stop it? And at one point, I stopped the conversation and said, nobody's going to stop it because the cavalry isn't coming. We're the cavalry. We have to be the ones to stop it, right? So that's kind of where that came from. It worked, and by early February, the city voiced, because there was so much vocal public opposition to the sale of this park, they announced that they were going to take it off of the selling block, and also establish a special advisory committee to study options for keeping the property. The reason why they were going to sell it was because golf had been losing money consistently over the past 5 years, and costing the taxpayers money to subsidize golf instead of going to other purposes. So they formed this 5-member special advisory committee in February 2016, over with a resolution by the Common Council. In the meantime, some of us started doing some other public education events over at Elbel Park. Amanda and I drew up a bunch of these flyers, and every Sunday I was doing bird hikes out there to try to get folks who were not golfers, who had never been to that property, to realize that we actually had this ecologically significant property in the western area of the county. And then, probably kind of piggybacking off of that, in April of 2016, we started the In Nature Facebook group, largely because we realized that we did have a problem with environmental education in the state of Indiana, but it's not really an Indiana problem. It's a national problem, right? We don't appreciate the things that we have because we don't understand them, and we don't know that we need to understand them or to keep them. And so we started this initiative with a mission statement of being a community for people with an appreciation of nature, conservation, ecology, and the natural sciences, to come together, share knowledge, inform, and inspire others in and around the Hoosier State, and most importantly, where everyone is a student and a teacher. And so out of this 5-person special committee came a number of recommendations. One was to hire a golf course professional to try to figure out how to keep the property from bleeding money. But the second recommendation, which was one that they had succumbed to public pressure, was to engage with ecological consultants to study what was there. The city had owned this property since 1965, but there was no inventory, no species inventory of what the plants and animals that were present there had ever been done. And so that was something that the city commissioned a study of, which began in the spring of 2016, the entire golf course and the wetlands surrounding it. And then later in that year, in August, the special committee also made a recommendation to the city council and then ultimately to the board of park commissioners to kind of keep that, even though they had paid for a consultant to come in to do the ecological assessment, they thought it was a really good idea, based on the things that the consultant was finding, the plants and animal species that were turning up. They thought it would be a really good idea to keep that momentum going and establish a permanent committee to advise the park board on the ecological properties of all of the South Bend Park properties. And there's over 60 of them, I believe. So they went to the park board with this request to form this committee called the Ecological Advocacy Committee. And it was actually a dual purpose resolution. The second purpose was to fulfill the requirements of Tree City USA. So like probably most people are familiar with the Tree City USA program, which is sponsored by the National Arbor Day Foundation. And one of the requirements of Tree City USA is that cities and towns have to have a citizens tree board or tree committee of some sort. And we hadn't had one here in South Bend for a couple of decades probably. And so this was sort of a dual purpose to get back to that, to fulfill the requirements of that. The wrong direction button. And so the Ecological Advocacy Committee was formed in late 2016. I'm going to bring Amanda into the story now because I was really kind of a bystander at this point. I was involved in the El Bell for Everyone movement, kind of on the secondary tier. But when the call came out for applicants to the Ecological Advocacy Committee, I initially wasn't going to do it, and Amanda more or less convinced me that I had to do it because it was my civic responsibility, and wrote the application for me. So
I had to do that in order for it to happen.
Yeah, I was not going to do it clearly because I'm not the type of person who really goes out and applies for things. Including jobs. So like if I do something, it's usually because somebody asks me to do it. And so this was a photograph of the initial Ecological Advocacy Committee was formed from experts from different areas in the community. So we had, for example, a park director on the original EAC. We had a botanist, we had a student member, we had a aquatic biologist, we had the director of the sustainability minor at Notre Dame, and a few other people. And so that was formed in late 2016. And in 2017, the primary objective, which was something that was called for the Park Board resolution, was to establish a natural resource management plan. And this was in 2017 was largely done by the park department, which in South Bend is called Venues, Parks and Arts. So their staff largely put this together, but a couple of important things came out of the 2017 Natural Resource Management Plan, or NRMP. One was the identified topics of concern that you see in the middle block there. And these were drilled out by the committee itself, being essentially interviewed by the staff as to what are some of the different areas of concern that you have in our park properties. And they boiled them down into the 6 different categories: aquatic resource management, education, land policies, management of trees, vegetation management, wildlife management. And then each of those, of course, has a bunch of subtopics. The second thing that came out of this was the identification of the sensitive park properties, the ones that are more sensitive than others anyway. I mentioned that South Bend has approximately 60 plus park properties, but many of them are small neighborhood pocket parks that really don't have any ecological elements to them, but a lot of them do. And the ones that do, we came up with a list and elevated them to indicate that anything that really that was to occur to these park properties would require some extra attention to them. So the way that the vegetation ordinance kind of ties into this was in April 2018, the city hosted its annual Arbor Day giveaway sale, like many cities do. Most, I don't know about most, but a lot of them do in Indiana. We'll have an Arbor Day event that will include a tree sapling giveaway. And prior to that event, the EAC was given a list of a flyer of the trees that they were planning on giving away. And the title of the flyer indicated that it was a native tree giveaway. And upon closer examination of the flyer, I think there were probably, and we weren't able to find a copy of the original flyer. This one's gone to the ages, but I think, Amanda, what would you say? There were 8 or 9 trees probably that they were giving away, and and calling native trees. And of the 8 or 9 trees, I think we determined that probably maybe 4 of them were not actually native to South Bend, and some of them weren't even native to like North America. But the Department of Sustainability was actually advertising this too, and so things going to grow legs, and they were going, here's, come get your native tree, and I'm like, no, these are, some of them are native, but not all of them. So they eventually changed the title of the brochure and took down the advertising for it. They weren't terribly invasive trees, but the point is, if you're going to call them native, then they should be native trees. So the document that you see on the right side of this photo is the official tree list for South Bend. And a lot of communities in Indiana, almost all of the larger cities and towns in Indiana, have some sort of a tree list. And what this is it's put together in a variety of ways, sometimes just by the city forester, sometimes by the tree board, other community councils in some cases. But the master tree list is one that essentially they're saying these are the ones that are suitable for planting within our community. And so Amanda and I took a deep dive into the master tree list. I'm going to let you talk here for a little bit about this, because this was kind of something that you helped to really champion.
Well, I think when you start looking at some of these municipal lists, whether they're county or city, it can be kind of shocking to see the amount, or actually species of trees that are non-native, many of which are non-native. And you can see South Bend's list was large, I think 232 trees. Most are not this large, but some are. So it was, I had started very early on and working as a naturalist. Colors can make it easy. So the initial way that we listed or grouped these was based on trees that were green. They were native to Indiana. Yellow, they were native to, essentially North America. Orange was a classification we gave for exotic species outside of North America that had not shown signs of escaping and naturalization. Pink were ones that showed early signs of the ability to escape and naturalize. And then red were known invasive species. So we had, almost about half, I guess, of based on the graph here, it's been a while, but of species on this list that were non-native, actually over half, and some of which were escaping or known invasive. So it was a kind of a shocking pie graph when you start looking at, these are the trees that our tax dollars are paying to be put in. And based on the ordinance, these trees are being put in specifically along roadways, but sometimes these lists have legs and they end up being used by planning and zoning departments. And so it provided kind of an initial look at really deep diving into these lists of trees that without second thought are being used in our cities. And in many cases, these trees, especially the ones that have invasive tendencies, are escaping into certainly old fields. We see that all the time. Bradford pear is a great example we'll talk about, but they're escaping into functional ecosystems as well within our cities and towns and counties, including in our parks.
And I want to follow up a little bit on that red category, because the red category here represents the trees that are, quote, officially invasive, close quote, in Indiana. And the reason that they have that designation is they were given that by the Indiana Invasive Species Council. And I assume that most folks here are familiar with the Indiana Invasive Species Council, but as a quick recap, it was formed in 2009, signed into law by then Governor Mitch Daniels. And the objective is to enhance the ability of government agencies to detect, prevent, monitor, and manage new and long-term invasions, as well as increase public awareness about invasive species. So the original the Invasive Species Council is made up of representatives from a wide variety of backgrounds, from natural land managers, the agriculture, also the horticulture industry. And so in 2015, the IISC created this official invasive plant list, and they gave the different plants that were on the list these 4 different designations. So the worst level, or the highest level, was called high, and there were 66 species on there. 20 that were considered to be medium invasive, 1 that was considered to be a low invasive, and 33 with the caution designation. And when going through these slides, we added some of the ones that you would probably, the average person would probably recognize as being parts of these categories. So like the high would be, the Norway maple, and also Callery pear, and the honeysuckles, and those sorts of things. And so moving forward a little bit, then our next step was to, after we found this document and we were able to actually quantify what our local government was condoning that people plant, we went to the city forester with it initially, and he said, well, you know what, we're not planting Callery pear anymore, but other people still are in town, and they're not necessarily following the procedures to do so. And we said, well, who's doing that? And he said, well, Public Works and some of the projects that they oversee are putting in things that that I don't approve of. And so we made the EAC, the Ecological Advocacy Committee, then actually made this official recommendation to the Board of Park Commissioners. And that's who you see in the photograph here. It's actually 3 commissioners, the executive director and the park board attorney in the photo. But we sent them this letter, and essentially there were, the uptick was that we reminded them that like many cities in Indiana, the jurisdiction for trees falls with the park department. And this is tricky because it usually refers to street trees. And so South Bend is like much of Indiana in that regard. The city forester works for the park department, and the park department is overseen by the Board of Park Commissioners. But when it comes to things like the Board of like Public Works, Department of Public Works allowing other contractors to plant some things that the city forester objects to, we reminded the Board of Park Commissioners that it's their jurisdiction, their responsibility to enforce some of the rules that we already have. And then we also pointed out to them that some of the code that was actually pointed out to us by the city forester was very obsolete. So Chapter 19 of South Bend Municipal Code deals with trees and vegetation, and the sections of that chapter 13 and 14 dealt with prohibited vegetation as well as prohibited trees along the tree lawn or the city streets, the right-of-way. And so we suggested to the park board, one, that they enforce their jurisdiction to control what other agencies are doing with planting these street trees, but 2, also bringing to their attention the fact that these ordinances were very outdated. And so South Bend has, the County Council of South Bend has a number of committees, and one of them is called the Parks and Recreation Committee, or the PARC Committee. And at the time, Council Member Sharon McBride was the chair of the PARC Committee, and she happened to be at that park board meeting where I delivered that report to them, pointing out some of the problems with their ordinances and their enforcement. And she invited me to speak to the PARC committee about updating these ordinances, because the ordinances themselves are not under the jurisdiction of the park department. So that's where the term conundrum comes in. The EAC is a advisory council to the park board, not to the city council, but we still have some influence in this case. So I was able to go to the park committee, PARC committee, and convince them that we needed to take a good look at some of these old ordinances that in fact haven't been updated since the 1960s, this chapter 19, 13, and 14. And also the fact that we have things like calorie pear that are still legal to be planted in the city, even though the forester's not planting them. Other people supposedly are along our right of ways. And even though the DNR has clearly asked people, like a year or two prior, released a statement to asking folks to stop planting these trees. And so they were very much on board with the idea of updating the ordinances and agreed that it was something that needed to be done. This was July of 2018. So a month after that, of course, Knox County passed an invasive plant ordinance, which at the time was the most progressive in Indiana. And they did this for those up north who don't necessarily know where it's at. It's in the southwestern area of Indiana. And they did it with through the county commissioners. And they basically, what they did was they made it illegal to buy, sell, transport, or plant all of the plants that were on the Indiana Invasive Species Council's high and medium list. And that went into effect in 2020. And so there's a lot more on this. Will Drews, who is with the Soil Conservation District down there, is somebody who we talked to along the way with this, because the South Bend was very interested in Knox County and how they did theirs, and more importantly, what the public reaction was to that. And so in 2008, in October of 2018, we had a meeting. This is actually the lodge in Howard Park in South Bend, which has recently been renovated. If you've never been there, it's a cool old WPA era building that some of the park offices are located in for South Bend. And we had a meeting around that time, and with a number of different people from the city. We had the director of public works, we had the city engineer, we had the director of facilities and grounds from the park department, we had the executive director of venues, parks, and arts, we had the city forester. Gosh, who am I leaving out here? Historic preservation department was involved in that also. And the idea here was that I was there representing the Ecological Advocacy Committee, but the idea was, let's get all of the people who are involved in doing these major decision makings together at the table, and let's figure out how we can solve this problem. And everybody there was very willing and conducive to what we were selling, with regards to not planting vegetation, trees in particular, that are going to be harming our environment. And so in particular, like, the Department of Public Works said, we're happy to plant what you tell us to plant. And so it was an important first step. And it was also the meeting where I had first introduced the proposed revisions to chapter 1913 and chapter 1914, because it had occurred to us around maybe 3 months or so after that meeting with the PARC committee, when nothing happened, that if anything was going to get done with these ordinances, that we would have to be the ones to write them ourselves. And so I took it back to the PARC committee in 2019. And so this is a few of the council members of the South Bend City Council at the time, along with the council attorney. And I gave them our proposed revisions to 1913 and 1914. And what we did, one of them dealt with the street trees, which was an old list. Most municipalities in Indiana have a street tree list. Like, they don't want you to plant certain things along the streets that cause problems, soft wooded trees that break, things that have shallow roots that push up sidewalks, conifers that block sight lines, things that drop fruit that could perhaps cause obstructions to sidewalks or pedestrian accidents, things of that nature, right? So we updated that with a more current list, added taxonomic names. If you look at some of these old municipal codes, they go by common names only. And the other thing that we did was we took that the section that dealt with prohibited vegetation. It only had one thing on it, and it was common barberry, berberis, what is it? Not Thunbergia, I can't think of it. Anyhow, that was prohibited back in that resolution, or that ordinance went back to the 1960s, because it was actually banned because it was an alternate host to wheat rot fungus. So it was an agricultural thing that, but that has not been a problem, because we've had rust-resistant wheat, I guess, since the 1960s. So that's how old some of these ordinances were. So going back to the title of the program, Till the Wheels Fall Off, I want to call attention to Sharon McBride, who I highlighted over there on the right-hand side, and she's also seated at the table in the back. When I got done explaining for the second time now to the PARC committee why we needed to update these ordinances and why invasive species were such a problem for South Bend and for other places in Indiana, and she paused. There was kind of a pause at the end of my presentation, and she looked over at me and she said, "I'm going to ride in your car." And I just kind of nodded, and she said, "I'm going to ride in your car until the wheels fall off." And I kind of smiled at her and I said, "Well, I appreciate that, and hopefully the wheels will never fall off." But it was a great show of support. So moving forward, in April 2019, this was the well-publicized Indiana and Terrestrial Invasive Plant Rule that was passed by the Natural Resources Commission, which prohibited 44 of the 46 highly invasive terrestrial plants that were on the IISC list. Now, you may remember that we showed 66 plants being on that list. The other ones were aquatic, and so they didn't apply to the terrestrial plant rule. So the ones, there were two that were in particular that were left off of the rule, which were considered highly invasive, which were Callery pear and Norway maple, and they did so because they were determined to be too important to the horticulture trade to lose, or to prohibit at that point. So we went back to the lodge. Let's see, 2020. I'm trying to remember. Oh, I know what it was. By this point, we had an election. We hadn't been able to move forward. We sent the proposed ordinances. I handed off to the legal department, and they sat there for about 10 months. I was bugging, what's going on with this sort of thing. In the meantime, we had an election, and we had like roughly half of the city council changed over. And so I'm like, now I've got to go, tell this whole story all over again to the new council members. So we scheduled that to happen in March, and this was another one of these meetings with some of the city leaders, and Sharon McBride was there, and she was still riding in my car, and she said, "I'm going to get you back on the park committee in March, and we're going to get this done." Well, guess what happened in March? da 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 da, right? COVID comes along and screws up everything. And so, like, you know, the mayor at this point sent out a memo to like all the city agencies and said, and councils and committees, and said, don't meet in public, don't get together to meet unless it's for like absolutely critical public business to keep the city running, that sort of thing. And so I was certainly not in a position to be able to say we need to continue forward with the vegetation ordinance, because there were obviously much more important things going on. But we used 2020 to do something really progressive. And I pulled in Amanda primarily on this. You may remember the 2017 Natural Resource Management Plan that was really done by the Park Department upon interviewing the EAC. This one, we took all of those identified topics of concern that the EAC had identified back in 2017, and we expanded it. And Amanda and I did all, the majority of the writing on this, along with input from subcommittees from the EAC that we had assembled to be able to help with putting together some of the components of this. And so now we actually had something. We went from having this document that just kind of showed, you know, these things like, well, okay, we're concerned about this, to actual actionable steps. We took this document from being around a 10-page document to approximately an 80-page document. And one of the action steps that we wrote in was the city code. Like, we need to get the city code changed. And the park board in, I don't have a slide for this, but in December of 2000, well, maybe we do. We'll get to that. The park board actually wound up ratifying the Natural Resource Management Plan into policy. So now this has more of a bite to it, right? Because we now have an official entity, the Board of Park Commissioners, who have approved this document, and contained within this document is the action step of trying to change the city code to deal with the invasive species. So in October of 2020, and you can tell it's 2020 or 2021, this will go into like the time capsule because everybody's wearing masks, of course. I attended a Arbor Day festival. You can also tell it's Arbor Day, or it's 2020, because Arbor Day took place in October instead of in April when it's officially Arbor Day. So there's Sharon McBride in the plaid, and she approached me at that event, and she said, I still want to do that ordinance. And I said, okay, I'm ready, whenever you are. Back to the park committee again. I think this was either number 3 or 4, right? And so, but again, brand new council, brand new committee. So I presented virtually an abbreviated version of the programs that I had done before, and basically just told them what we wanted to change on section chapter 19, 13, and 14. And they approved it. They voted that day to move ahead with it, advanced it to the full council. A couple of days after that, I did an interview with the Tribune, and I wasn't exactly, the South Bend Tribune, that is, I wasn't exactly sure how the article was going to run, but lo and behold, it came out as the headline of the Sunday paper, which I was expecting this to be like one of those things in, the back cover of section 3 or something like that. But, that morning I go to look at the paper, and here it is, full center on the headline. And so this was all moving like really, really fast. And something like really amazingly coincidental and unplanned came about. And that was the fact that this ordinance was coming up for vote at the same time that calorie pear was flowering everywhere in South Bend. So it was like on everybody's minds. They could see it everywhere, and this was calling attention to the fact that, hey guys, this is an invasive plant species that's kind of everywhere. And then WSBT television asked me to do an interview with them, and I did that. And I was really kind of surprised by just how much this thing had grown legs. And so Amanda and I put together a YouTube video for the city council to watch. And this is on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and look for Indiana Nature, you'll find that. This was a video that I specifically did, basically addressing the county, or the council members, to try to educate those who had not been part of the PRC committee as to what was going on. So we waited for community feedback, and it's interesting. Prior to the article running in the paper, I received a call from Council Member McBride one day, and I don't know. I'll go ahead and tell the story on this, but I'm not sure if it was really public knowledge or not. But she called me up and she said that I just got out of a meeting and I had like 4 phone calls from the Tribune, 4 missed calls, and she goes, "Is something terrible going on with the ordinance?" And I said, "Oh no, I think they just want to get your quote." So far, like all of the landscapers that they interviewed in the nurseries were all supportive of it, so we didn't have any feedback. But I did get an email from one of the council members who sent along an email that she had received from a citizen who had a problem with the ordinance. And I went, oh boy, and I looked at it, but the problem was that she was afraid that it wasn't strict enough. And she points out that the Indiana DNR terrestrial plant rule leaves out a lot of invasive plants. And so I contacted her directly and I said, no, glad to inform you that our ordinance prohibits all of that. I didn't mention that, I don't think, up until this point. Our ordinance prevented the sale and transportation and planting of all of the plants identified as invasive by the Indiana Invasive Species Council, not just the high, not just the medium, but also the low and the caution as well. Okay, Amanda, I'm going to turn this over to you at this point.
Okay.
Talk a little bit about this.
So sorry, the reflections. Okay, yes.
I can start it off. I think
Okay.
Going kind of an overview of what we had learned to this point led us to our next venture, right? So we had looked at this recommended tree list from South Bend, and with all of these non-native trees, and we wondered if this is South Bend the Lone Ranger here, or is everybody doing this? Is it unusual for these ordinances to be so outdated going back to the 1960s, right?
Right. I think we also found that the sustainability was something that we all are sitting in a meetings. Some cities are progressive, have sustainability offices, but ecological sustainability seems to be an outlier. There seems to be very little interest or knowledge in these sustainability groups about what we're doing ecologically in our communities related to plants. So there's a misconnection or a missed connection in those kind of realms. And so that was something else that we were putting together. So we wanted to take a lot of these things that we were finding, learning, and questioning further. And then our lucky break came. The Indiana University Sustainability Development Program contacted us, and they let us know about a fellowship program that they had, and they asked if we had any projects that we could benefit from having a fellowship intern participate in helping us with. And we immediately thought of this project of all of the questions that came up in that last slide, and how we would like to dig deeper into Indiana statewide and see if there are the same problems plaguing all of the communities as what we had in South Bend. And so we were awarded a sustainability intern, and lo and behold, amazingly enough, it was somebody we both knew. You can talk him up a little Sure,
bit.
Matthias.
First.
Yeah, so Matthias is a local Central Indiana, Indianapolis native, and yeah, I've known him through my ventures here at Cool Creek with birding and bird watching in the county, and we hosted the Indiana Young Birders Conference with Ken and Kimberly Kaufman, which some of you may know of, back, I think this photo was from 2013, but Matthias and I have been friends, and I know Steve and his daughters were part of the Indiana Young Birders Club. And so we were just tickled pink to find out that Matthias, now a college student, had been assigned to our fellow as our fellow through the IU Sustainability Program. And Matthias, as a birder, I'll speak to a little bit, really understood the disconnect that we have with plants and with biodiversity. And that's really what we were finding, and why we feel that even street trees are so important to an overall biodiverse community, but a healthy community. So when we're putting in invasive species along our streets, it's no wonder that we're seeing decline in species and biodiversity, and also spending millions of dollars in our parks to rid, or at least try to rid, our functional ecosystems of these plants, and then how that impacts species. So Matthias had feet in so many different of these circles, which we're finding don't always mix together very much.
And a young man who cares so much that he is doing public speaking engagements at the age of 10 or 11 needs probably no other introduction. So anyway, so Matthias came on board with us a little bit later in 2021 after the semester was over. But back to the South Bend Common Council on April 26th, the Common Council had the second and third readings and passed the Invasive Species Ordinance of the two changes to Chapter 19 unanimously on a 9-0 vote, which was wonderful. And so this story really grew legs. Like within the days that followed, I couldn't believe it's being picked up by the Associated Press. And once the AP picked it up, it was shared all over the place. U.S. News and World Report, I'm seeing it in like the Seattle newspaper. It was really staggering how much publicity we got out of the deal. Agri News, and I did an interview with Indiana University South Bend student newspaper over this. An article entitled "The Stench of Spring." And so, what about enforcement? Well, there's a good question. It's always been in South Bend, they've always had the focus of education over enforcement. Although this is now, because it is a law, code enforcement does have the ability to be able to go into a business theoretically and be able to fine them, although that's not the intention of what we're doing here. We're trying to have businesses voluntarily comply on this. And we found, I think, in South Bend that the biggest offenders who are selling the invasive plants are these big box stores. And so, for example, this photo on the right I took in July of 2021, kind of as a test, winter creeper vine, euonymus. It was prohibited by the Indiana terrestrial plant rule and illegal in Indiana as of April of 2020. Well, here it is in July of 2021 for sale in Menards. So the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology Division of Indiana DNR is the enforcement wing for the terrestrial plant rule. And they advise citizens, if you see these plants for sale, to send them an email and contact them about it. So I did such in July of 2021, just to kind of see what would happen, and came back in, I think, September, and the plants were still sitting there. So they obviously didn't get to them. And so point being is that we're not always going to be able to rely upon the state to necessarily enforce these things. But I think our belief is that a little kindness can go perhaps a long way in convincing. We don't necessarily need to convince these retailers not to carry these things because it's illegal, but just simply by pointing out to them that they don't need to have this is probably the best solution for getting rid of them in a timely manner. But also there's opportunities for small businesses. We have a network of native plant growers in South Bend and a network of small plant growers and nurseries who are able to change their inventories a lot faster than, say, a Walmart or a Menards can change their inventory. So we're going to turn this over now to Matthias, and Matthias is going to talk about the project that we assigned him with, which was to take our study that we've conducted, the data that we collected on South Bend, and take it more to a statewide level and produce a report and some recommendations from that. So we'll turn it over to Matthias now to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So I'll just start briefly by talking about sustainability and where I'm coming from. Like Amanda mentioned, I got into birding when I was really little, and the birding kind of taught me the importance of habitat. And once I started getting into habitat protection, I realized that sustainability and environmental protection was kind of the path I wanted to take. So sustainability is kind of used as a buzzword now, that it's kind of like something that means environmentally friendly, but there's a lot more to sustainability than just being eco-friendly. And there's social sustainability, there's economic sustainability, and of course, environmental sustainability. But once you break down environmental sustainability, you see that there's a lot of different subsets of it, that some of which often get overlooked. And in the case of this project, we found that ecological sustainability was really being overlooked within Indiana. And we were focusing more of these ordinances on economic sustainability. So that brings us to the project, which I started gathering data from ordinances in about May of this year. And I found data from all of the 92 counties in Indiana. And the method of that was to go by county seat. So that's usually the largest town in the county, but sometimes it's not. If I couldn't find data from that city, then I tried my best to find a pretty populated replacement for it. And then another additional 16 cities in Indiana from counties that are more populated that have a lot of cities. So Hamilton County with Noblesville, Westfield, and Carmel, for example, and up in the region, we had a few from Chesterton and Valparaiso, stuff like that. So the point of gathering all this data was to really look at where Indiana's tree ordinances and vegetation ordinances stand. And a tree ordinance can be classified into three different types. There's your classic street and park tree ordinances, which is a lot of what we're dealing with. There is tree protection ordinances, which is looking more at protecting historical trees, specific tree species, trees of a certain measurement, and calling for the replacement of trees that have been removed. And then your third category deals with view ordinances, and that's trees blocking motorists and pedestrians. So out of those three, a lot of the ones we dealt with in Indiana were street and park tree ordinances. And we found that there was overall a lack of tree protection ordinances, which are really important. And then on the other side, we also looked at vegetation ordinances, which was a name we just kind of gave to ordinances that deal with weeds and rank vegetation. So these are your classic ordinances that say you can't grow your lawn over a certain height, but they ban specific species known as noxious plants. And we found that the definition of weeds and rank vegetation were varying greatly from municipality to municipality. So once all this data was gathered, we started preparing a report of findings, which is kind of what we're coming up on now. And we had this overarching goal of advancing, like I just mentioned, something that's often overlooked, ecological sustainability. So the next slide shows our preliminary findings. And like Steve and Amanda mentioned earlier, a lot of these ordinances were written a long time ago, and they're now outdated. It's not to say that they're not solid code, but we know a lot more now than we did 40 years ago. A problem with that too is a lot of them are kind of copy paste. And just because an ordinance works for one municipality doesn't mean it's going to work for a neighboring municipality. Like I just mentioned too, there's a lot of ambiguity and subjectivity in what constitutes rank vegetation and weeds. And that just comes from municipalities just changing the wording here and there, but there not being an overall statewide term for each of these. We found a lot of municipalities that didn't have any tree ordinances at all. And if they mentioned trees, it was only very briefly in zoning documents, which aren't necessarily the most user-friendly documents. And we also found that some ordinances actually discouraged native species. And that was a culprit in vegetation ordinances that banned milkweed. And finally, like I've mentioned a lot, the tree ordinances mostly deal with proper care and maintenance, which is definitely necessary to, create a safe environment. But they don't always have an element that can advocate for and create a more sustainable urban landscape. And what I mean by that is it doesn't always advocate for genetic diversity and banning invasive species. So to wrap this up, some good examples, let's start with the bad examples first. So like I just mentioned, milkweed was prohibited in counties like Adams, White, and Whitley counties. And that's a problem because milkweed is famously known as a host plant for the monarch butterfly. And in a few other counties, we found that there was a weird statement that said that vegetation can cause increased instances of insects and vermin. And they weren't very specific on what the insects and vermin were. And as we all know, insects are very important for creating a sustainable ecosystem. But to end on a good note, like Steve talked about earlier, Knox County's invasive species ban is a really encouraging piece of a city code that has been done. Bloomington's landscape ordinance specifically advocates for genetic diversity and calls for developers planting pollinator plants that can be used by native pollinators in their new developments. And in Rising Sun, which is a small town in Ohio County in southeast Indiana, there are exemptions to the vegetation ordinance that encourage the planting of native species and native grasses, which is important because if you have an ordinance that bans grass growing over a certain height, a lot of native grasses are taller than that, and your neighbor can call code enforcement on you and you can get fined for just trying to do the right thing. So that kind of brings us to where we are now with this report, and I'll hand it back over to Steve.
And just yesterday, we came up with a working title for our report, which we now call a guide, and we're calling it Local Government's Impact on Ecological Sustainability, subtitle, The Guide to the Ordinances, Policies, and Initiatives Affecting Indiana's Ecosystems. I'd like Amanda actually to talk about this a little bit, please.
Sorry. The goal here is to provide first kind of an idea of where, if you're in a city right now, and hopefully we're covering it if it's a fairly large city or within your county, to give you an idea of what those ordinances say currently. As Steve found, it is important that when you're trying to rewrite these things, it's better if you have an example, if you could just give it to them. Our lawmakers and our elected officials and all of these people don't always necessarily want to do that work or even have the expertise to do it. So the first part of that is to provide kind of a where are we now? And I think it's a reflection of a lot of lack of education and a lot of different factors related to ecology. And then it's providing what we can do in the future to make our cities more sustainable and just make better choices ecologically. The general audience will be hopefully very broad, certainly elected leaders and officials, certainly sustainability professionals. We'd like to make a much bigger tent. I've joked around a few times when I've sat at within sustainability functions. A lot of times, the plant people kind of get put together with kind of the growing your own food groups and these types of things, and it is different. They're equally important, but it is understanding our local ecology, and it's actually not as scary or hard as it sounds. So certainly, educators and students, Indiana's current climate in regards to the kind of being more progressive is a little hard, obviously, to navigate, but I do believe with folks like Matthias in the wings and others that we have some real ability to change and make progress. So conservation groups, plant enthusiasts, and I think, as Steve is a great example, private citizens that are interested in making change. That's our focus group. So it's pretty much anyone who likes, birds and butterflies and and likes clean air and all of these things. So
yeah, and I think at some point we had to come to the determination: do we want to write something that comes off more of as like a scientific journal article, or do we want something that appeals more to a lay person? And we're attempting to do something that kind of falls in between. I think by the time we're all said and done, this document is going to be well over 400 pages long. And we've been working for literally on months writing it, and we had hoped to have it done before today, but it's not. So now the new current date is something ambiguous, as early 2022. But just to give you some sneak peeks of what would be inside of it, this is some quantification of the work that Matthias did, where he went and looked. This is a particular county, Adams, because it's alphabetically first. So that's why we picked it, because we wrote it first. But it gives a kind of a snapshot of the cities and towns that are contained, where Adams is at, some of the local environmental initiatives, what the tree ordinances look like, what the purview is, what they pertain to, in other words, whether if there's a noxious weed or vegetation ordinance. We wrote a synopsis on that. We give links to the code where you can go and find all of this stuff. The ordinance history goes back to whether or not, this is something from the 1960s or the 1980s. We looked at that and then kind of summarized that with the notes. So we'll have one of these for all 92 counties in Indiana. Another thing that we did was we took that in Indiana Invasive Species Council list, which, by the way, was updated in 2020 and now has a lot more, 16 or so more highly invasive plants are now contained on this list. And we put all of that into a chart, and we looked at the years that these things were introduced, where they came from, and their pathway. So, were they introduced intentionally, accidentally? Were they a food crop? Were they an ornamental? To try to give some background on just where these problems are originating from. It's been said many times that most of these come from the ornamental trade, ornamental landscape trade, which is true. Now we can quantify that based on the Indiana species in particular. A timeline of all of these plants. So we go all the way back to the founding or the first settlement of the Europeans in North America, and we look at where the invasive plants started coming in throughout history. Wild parsnip, for example, was probably the first one that was first invasive plant known to be introduced in the United States, was a food crop by the settlers. And so the conclusions on as far as the South Bend thing goes, I mean, it took 3 years to make this happen, which is a long time. But if I had to do it again, I could do it a lot faster because I know a lot more about navigating city government. And that's one of the things that we hope to impress upon maybe some of you in the program today, but also more so in the report, on just how to go about getting these things done, and also to give you some ammunition through the guide of things that you'd be able to take to some of your city and county leaders to be able to show them some of the data that's out there. In hindsight, we probably shouldn't have written the prohibited street trees into the ordinance. And I thought about this later as we were researching some of the ordinances where for example, Fort Wayne has an ordinance where they have a street tree list in the code, and then they also have a street tree list that's done by the park department. And the reason for the two lists is that it's a lot of work to get it changed in the city code versus the the park department can have a much more fluid list. So like what we did with that chapter 19, section 14 was we didn't write all of the invasive plants into the code. Instead, we said that we weren't going to allow the planting or the sale or the transfer of any of the plants on the Indiana Invasive Species Council's official list. So that ties it to this external list, which is, I think, the better way to go.
And if that list, or when that list is updated by the council, it will be part of what's banned in South Bend at that point.
Automatically updates here as well. Exactly. And it took tenacity and determination. Obviously, I think I was at the park committee 4 times, in front of the city council once, at the park board numerous times, smaller meetings at the lodge 2 or 3 times. And I want to speak, a little bit about trust and relationship building, because I think, that's something that entered into this equation as well too, where I had one of the park board members that actually came to me in like year 4 or year 5 and said, when the city council first came to us and told us that they wanted us to establish this committee, we weren't really all that keen on it. We didn't know what this was going to mean to us, whether you guys were going to come in here and cause problems for us or not. And then she goes on to say, but now we can't imagine not having you, because we rely on you for so many decisions impacting the ecology of our public lands. And following the city passing of this ordinance, 2 county officials contacted me from St. Joe County and said, do we need to do this in St. Joe County too, countywide? And my response was, yeah, that would be great, but let's just wait a little while. I want to see how this kind of goes over in South Bend, how it works, how enforcement goes, and that sort of thing. Because I mean, frankly, and this goes to the trust issue, is that I don't want to put a particular politician out there and have them get trampled on for my idea that doesn't necessarily work well. And lastly, it took a village, and I want to give this is a big call out to city officials in South Bend. The South Bend Common Council, who voted 9-0 to pass this ordinance. The South Bend Mayor, James Mueller, who signed it. The Board of Park Commissioners, who were supportive all the way. And then the venue's Parks and Arts staff, who also really pushed hard to make this happen. And another thing that I think is a really important takeaway from this slide is that if you look at the images, if you look at the folks on this slide, you see a lot of diversity here. And I know, like, conservation groups are all struggling right now, trying to figure out how to be more inclusive, how to get more people of color involved in their organizations and involved in environmental issues, which typically haven't been something that's been very diverse. And I look at the folks in South Bend and I see that we have, a really diverse group that passed one of the most progressive things that's been done environmentally in Indiana history. And I want to end on the Rooftopper Hypothesis. So this is a German scientist, Paul Ehrlich, who you may have heard this before, applied to ecosystems, the Rooftopper Hypothesis, where each species in an ecosystem represents a rivet on an airplane. And once you start losing these particular rivets, you might be able to lose, say, 5 or 10%, and the airplane can still fly. But you get to some point, there's that magical rivet that's the last one that's holding the airplane apart, and the whole thing crashes and goes to the ground. And I like to think of that in terms of all of the people who went into making this environmental change happen in South Bend. The mayor, the city council, the park board, public works was involved, the attorneys, VPA leadership and staff, all of my colleagues from the EAC, and there's probably been over 20 of them. I'm one of 2 of the original charter members still remaining. The city engineer was involved, numerous supportive citizens who voiced their support in this. And so, if you take out 1 or 2 of these people, these elements, the plane still flies, right? We can still get this ordinance done. But if we start taking out a bunch of them, we eventually get to the point where the plane crashes and the ordinance doesn't get done. But thankfully, you know, we had such a great group of people from around the city that we were able to get. Last slide, Amanda.
Yes, in my involvement, was definitely kind of auxiliary. I was kind of there for counsel for Steve as he was working through all of these and jumping through all of these hoops. My broad takeaways on this is first, my involvement in the Indiana Nature LLC's involvement in our guide or report that we're producing will hopefully provide a pathway for people who are looking to do similar things in the community. We're finding even in the current codes and ordinances that every community is a little different, and that pathway I think will be a little different. But what I learned through Steve's involvement and kind of the ups and downs is that first off, basic nature education is required on all levels, even for elected officials. I included something from Facebook actually, where Steve, through his role with the EAC, has helped the VPA or the Parks Department there in South Bend with programming, with hikes, which we saw earlier, and with Facebook spots where we're talking. He's in this case talking about Elbel and the changing of seasons, and with the park director. And that's just it's more. It is definitely kind of that relationship building, providing trust, because Aaron Perry in this case, their park director was a huge player in getting this done. And so it just requires, I almost don't want to call it volunteering, but it's showing up and it's providing those trust-based communications where these people who are going to put a lot of faith and sometimes personal kind of fallbacks potentially if something doesn't go quite right, they're going to put that into you. So those relationships take time. And then in this case, I think at South Bend, certainly Steve showed up for other things that were controversial. There were other environmental initiatives the city was working on, and he provided an EAC. Really, this particular committee group has provided sort of a shield of experts, really, who can speak to whatever the city's doing environmentally. As sound, when it is sound at least, and they can provide that kind of backup, I think, which is also a key factor. Then what we also found is that there are a lot of great ideas that staff have, and I work for county government in this case, and in many cases, some of the best ideas might be in the staff level, but there are a lot of tiers in that, and it sometimes takes outside community members and experts, community leaders that are not elected officials, that are not county government or city government employees, to actually put those ideas and push them further. Sometimes those of us in the trenches, as to say, can't really do that. Our voice is heard often enough that it is drowned out sometimes, but community leaders and citizens can push things forward faster. And then
I would, sorry to cut you off. I would add to that also that in many cases, public employees cannot do that.
Yeah, there's absolutely, and I
states that they will not comment on things.
They will not, cannot, and in many cases, even like a director type position, there's difficult relationships with elected officials, and they can only push so hard, or are not allowed to push at all. And then if you can, and I think this was key in what Steve accomplished in South Bend, and the EAC and everyone involved, was to find a supporter that feels the way that Sharon McBride did when I'm going to ride into your car, in your car until the wheels fall off, and then got to make sure they don't fall off. So those were my takeaways broadly, and things that I would like to see and be involved in my own community, and certainly statewide.
The end.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda and Steve and Matthias, for the presentation, but really all of the amazing work that you're accomplishing, that you've accomplished for your communities. But really, I think we're all excited about the book that you referenced. We did have a few questions regarding that, whether when that is available. It would be amazing, Steve and Amanda and Matthias, if you guys could, let us know, and then we can help make sure that gets distributed to all the folks who participated today, and really all of friends of ILPA. So please, if that's possible, that would be amazing.
We had intended to put an email address or something, I think, towards the end there, so where people could send us a email to ask for a copy of it. But I'm happy also just to send it to you if you're able to broadcast it widely.
That would be awesome. Thank you so much. And the second thing is, we did have a question regarding whether this would be recorded. So the presentation was recorded. We hope that you will share this. I think a lot of the information that Amanda and Steve and Matthias provided is really just so valuable, and hopefully you all feel as inspired as I do to figure out ways that we can really use all of this information to be better advocates for all of our communities. And then we did have we had two questions pertaining to the presentation. So one, thank you. I know we went over time, so thank you all for sticking with us, but I really didn't, I lost track of time because the presentation was so amazing. So thank you. One of the questions pertaining to the presentation was, and I'm trying to go back, how much resistance, Steve, did you get from nursery and box store sellers?
None. Not a one. The article that I referenced in the Tribune was written by Joe Ditz, who writes a column for the Tribune, and he went to a couple, at least one, I can't remember, it was one or two nurseries, and got them on the phone, local smaller nurseries, and asked if this was going to be impacting their business at all. And they said, they mostly said that they weren't even selling these plants to begin with, and secondly, that it would not. There's one thing that we didn't include a slide for that I should probably point out, though. That's just something I mentioned to Amanda just yesterday, and that is that a couple of these are going to be like really tough to enforce. One is wild parsnip, which is on the Invasive Species Council's list, is technically the same species as the thing that you would go buy the seed and plant in your garden. And so that's probably not something that's ever going to be really enforced. And then also Lysomachia, or creeping jenny, is a plant that's found in hanging baskets, and it's not typically identified as being one of the components. So I could see a problem with enforcement there. But I think really it's going to boil down to education. The EAC has formed a subcommittee on educating folks about the invasive species ordinance, and so there's some people who are in the process of producing brochures, and we kind of partially sold this by going to the city council and saying that we were going to be the ones who were going to be leading the educational charge on this.
Wonderful.
I think it's probably important too that South Bend is a fairly progressive city. So the fact that the two landscapers that or the nursery folks that Joe had interviewed had, I think, he had already stopped selling Bradford pear. That's not going to be as easily done statewide, certainly, and I know that it's one of the reasons it probably wasn't included. But I think it is important that they see that the resistance. I think that a lot of lawmakers, possibly on the state level, who are afraid of resistance, perhaps that's just unfounded. And regardless, it's just silly and irresponsible that people are still making profit off of these species that we know currently are causing a lot of environmental damage. And there are a lot more species that we've identified on these state lists that I think will become problematic in the years to come.
I think also, trying to remember here, I forgot what I was going to say now. What did you say right before that?
Bradford pears are being sold throughout this.
Yeah, the Bradford pear. I went when I was the last time that I went to the PARC committee, I pointed out to them the fact that, you know, Bradford pear and Norway maple were still permitted by the state to be sold, but the growers ought to see the writing on the wall by this point. Much was made that these two species were omitted from that rule because of the fact that people still had them in production and they didn't want to harm, you know, small businesses or whatever. Well, by the time that I got to the PARC committee, 2 years had passed since they had passed the terrestrial plant rule, and a full year had passed since it had gone into effect. And so if folks had not, who were growing these things at that point, were still investing in them, then they probably deserve to get stuck with them, really, because that's the writing on the wall is that these things are eventually going to go, I think, statewide as well. We just move forward a little bit faster.
Steve and Amanda, we have another question. Will the report include a sample code or a copy of South Bend's code?
Yes, both. I think we're gonna strive to have something that's perfect. And actually, that's a good question, because right now St. Joe County is in the process of establishing a county-wide noxious weed ordinance, and we looked at that, and it's pretty typical of most of the noxious weed ordinances. It doesn't have any provisions for native plant gardens and rain gardens and things like that, and things are typically measured, or noxious weeds are judged not by species but by height, and so that's something else that we need to get involved with really quick. But yeah, we definitely will have samples of good code and bad code.
And well, yes, not just South Bend, but Knox County. You know, we're stumbling upon some places. Bloomington has some good code. Fishers has some good code. You know, and sometimes it's a line here and there that are like, oh, I like the way they did that. It is different. It's not as ambiguous as Matthias pointed out. So much of the code is very ambiguous, to the point where, you know, a neighbor that's disgruntled could really call out somebody who has common milkweed growing on the side of their house, or Joe Pye weed, or something else. So we're hopeful that we can provide good code, you know, and good examples of code that are current, and then maybe meld those together and provide a really good solid code that could be used in most communities, or at least many. And South Bend's code is available if they want to start working now, and provide, you know, Knox County, that code is out there, and you can, you know, find that now, and we'd be happy to share it with you too. But it takes a lot of time, and, you know, these county websites and these code websites, ordinance websites, and so we're hopefully going to do a lot of that hard work and provide that in this report or book or guide, all these things that we're talking about, which will be widely available. We currently have a website, and it will be there, but there's a lot of other just nature education that can be found there. It's at indiananature.net, and that's there for everyone to start enjoying now. And but it'll be there. Our Facebook group is In Nature, or I In Nature, and we also have a Facebook page.
Also, I wanted to mention that the proposed St. Joe County ordinance actually has wording that says that if the vegetation doesn't fit the neighborhood, or something along those lines, if it doesn't, that Barbara's nodding. I know you probably remember exactly what it says, but it basically it says it implies that if your particular property doesn't keep up with the neighborhood that it's in, that it could be cited for noxious weeds. And I don't know about everybody here, but my yard certainly does not match the rest of the neighborhood. And I think that's true for most native plant gardeners.
Well, and I mean, that's where I think even the social sustainability comes into play at that point as well. So we start mixing some of these things together, and hopefully we can make a case how ecological sustainability needs to be front and center. And it's something we can do right now. The cities can do right now. You can do at home. Buying an electric car, putting solar panels on. These are things that eventually we hope to do, or we're saving up for. But being smarter in our ecological choices is something that we can do currently, and it goes a long way.
Yes.
Thank you. And I do see that one of our participants shared a link to St. Joseph County to be able to comment on the draft ordinance that you referenced. So that is in the chat. But Steve and Amanda, thank you. And Matthias, thank you so much for all of the great work that you're doing, for sharing it with us, for making it so relevant to all of our communities throughout Indiana. And yeah, just really appreciate all of you joining us this afternoon.
Thank you. Maybe at some point after we get it finished up, we can do another program to talk about the document itself.
We would love that. Thank you so much. I hope you all have a great evening, and we will definitely share this information that Steve and Amanda and Matthias provided, and as well as their contact information, because I'm sure questions will arise that they can certainly help us all navigate. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us.